Washington just pulled itself back from the edge. Again. A government shutdown was avoided at the last possible moment. Federal offices are open, workers are back on the job, paychecks are moving again, but don't get too comfortable. Because buried inside this deal is a warning sign most people are missing. And if you understand this one detail, you'll understand why it feels like the government is constantly on the brink and why this fight is far from over. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Does it feel like every few months we hear the same story? Another shutdown threat, another temporary solution, another promise that things will be different next time. If that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. Here's what actually happened. Late in the week, the House of Representatives narrowly passed a massive spending package, roughly $1.2 trillion, just enough to bring an end to a partial government shutdown. The vote wasn't comfortable. It wasn't bipartisan unity. It was razor-thin, 217 to 214. That margin alone tells you everything you need to know about how fragile this agreement really was. Once the bill passed, it moved straight to the White House. President Trump made it clear he would sign it without delay, and he did. That signature reopened most of the federal government. Agencies resumed operations. Federal workers returned. Immediate economic damage was stopped, at least on the surface. And for many Americans watching this unfold, it looked like a crisis resolved. But here's where the headlines stop, and where the real story begins. This bill did not treat every part of the government the same way. Most federal departments were funded all the way through September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. That includes major agencies like Treasury, Education, Labor, State, and Defense. In other words, for much of the government, the lights are on and expected to stay on for months. But one department was handled very differently, the Department of Homeland Security. Instead of long-term funding, DHS received only a short, temporary extension, just 2 weeks. That means, while most of Washington can breathe, one of the most powerful and controversial agencies in the federal government is already staring at another deadline, and that deadline is coming fast. So why isolate DHS? Why reopen the government, but leave one department dangling on a timer? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Congress could not agree on immigration enforcement. Rather than allowing the entire government to remain shut down over one issue, lawmakers chose to split the problem in half. They reopened most of the government while pushing the most explosive disagreement into a narrow window. Think of it like this: the house was on fire. Instead of fixing the wiring, Congress turned the power back on everywhere except one room and said, "We'll deal with that later." That later is now rapidly approaching. And the reason this fight became so intense goes beyond budget numbers. During negotiations, a tragic incident took place. 2 Americans were fatally shot during encounters with federal immigration agents in Minneapolis. That event changed everything. What had started as a standard funding debate suddenly became something much bigger. Questions about enforcement tactics, questions about accountability, questions about civil rights. For many lawmakers, especially Democrats, the idea of approving more money for DHS without stricter limits became impossible to justify. They argued that funding is power, and power without oversight leads to abuse. This is where frustration sets in for a lot of people watching from the outside, because budget bills are supposed to be boring. They're supposed to be spreadsheets, line items, and numbers. But this bill wasn't really about money anymore. It was about how the government uses force, who gets held accountable, and where the limits of federal authority should be. So yes, the shutdown ended, but the conflict did not. And that brings us to President Trump's role in all of this. In the past, shutdowns were often used as leverage. Long standoffs, public pressure, political brinkmanship. This time was different. According to lawmakers involved in the negotiations, Trump made it clear behind closed doors that he did not want another prolonged shutdown. He reportedly said he hates shutdowns. He urged Republicans to support the deal quickly, and he warned against dragging this out with last-minute demands. From the administration's perspective, reopening the government fast avoided economic damage and political fallout, especially after the country had already endured major shutdown disruptions in recent years. But it also did something else. It bought time. Instead of forcing a massive all-or-nothing fight, this deal delayed the hardest arguments and compressed them into a short, intense battle focused entirely on DHS. That decision may have avoided immediate chaos, but it guaranteed something else. Another showdown is coming. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the tension really starts to build. With the government reopened, Washington wants you to believe the crisis is over. But in reality, lawmakers have only moved the problem a few steps down the road, and that road leads directly to the Department of Homeland Security. Remember, DHS only received a 2-week funding extension. That clock is already ticking. When that deadline hits, Congress will have to make a decision. Either pass a new DHS funding deal or risk another partial shutdown, this time focused almost entirely on immigration enforcement, border operations, and federal agents. And unlike the last shutdown, this one would be far more targeted and far more political. Here's why. Senate Democrats have already laid out their demands, and they are not minor adjustments. They're calling for sweeping changes to how immigration enforcement operates. Among those demands, a ban on federal immigration officers wearing masks during operations, mandatory body cameras with visible identification, limits on roving patrols, judicial warrants required for arrests and searches, and stricter use of force rules, including independent investigations after violent incidents. From their point of view, these aren't radical ideas. They argue these are basic accountability standards, the same rules that many state and local police departments already follow. Their argument is simple. If local officers can operate with transparency, so can federal agents. They also point to trust, or the lack of it. When officers operate anonymously, especially in communities already under stress, public confidence collapses. And once trust is gone, enforcement becomes more volatile, more dangerous, and more prone to tragedy. But Republicans and administration officials see this very differently. They argue that these requirements would slow operations, create legal bottlenecks, and put officers at risk. Requiring judicial warrants for every enforcement action, they say, isn't realistic in fast-moving situations. They also claim that DHS agents already operate under constitutional limits, and that adding more layers could weaken enforcement when it's needed most. This is the core conflict, not money, not spreadsheets, but fundamentally different views on power, authority, and control. And this is why the next 2 weeks matter so much. There has already been one notable concession. Homeland Security officials announced that immigration officers in Minneapolis will now use body cameras, with plans to expand that program nationwide as funding allows. That move was clearly designed to lower public anger and signal accountability. But for many Democrats, it's not enough. They argue that body cameras without broader reforms don't address deeper questions about authority, oversight, and consequences. In their eyes, it's a partial fix, not a solution. And this brings us to a bigger truth about shutdowns today. They're no longer just budget fights. Years ago, shutdowns were about overall spending levels or tax policy. Now they're tied to cultural flashpoints and identity-driven debates. Immigration has become one of the most emotionally charged issues in American politics. It represents far more than border policy. It touches on national identity, civil liberties, federal power, and personal safety. That's why compromise is so hard. When values are on the line, splitting the difference feels like losing. And while politicians argue philosophy, real people absorb the consequences. Even short shutdowns create instability. Federal workers worry about paychecks. Contractors lose income with no guarantee of back pay. Government services slow or stop. Markets react to uncertainty. And when this cycle keeps repeating, something deeper happens. People start to lose confidence. Confidence that the government can keep the lights on. Confidence that basic operations can continue without brinkmanship. Confidence that stability is possible. For now, yes, the government is open. Most departments are funded. Paychecks are flowing again. That's the good news. But the margins were thin. The divisions were deep. And the DHS deadline is looming. If Congress fails to reach an agreement, the country could be right back here again, watching another shutdown threat unfold, centered on immigration enforcement. And even if lawmakers do reach a deal, there's no guarantee it will be permanent. Some have already warned that Congress may once again choose a short-term patch, buying time without resolving the underlying disagreement. That keeps the government running, but it keeps the anxiety alive. So when people ask, why does this keep happening? Here's the real answer. Because these fights aren't just about money anymore. They're about values. They're about authority. They're about accountability. And those are the hardest things to compromise on. It's okay if this feels exhausting. Many Americans feel worn down by constant deadlines, constant threats, constant uncertainty. Every shutdown is called temporary. But the stress it creates is very real. As we move forward, keep your eye on that DHS deadline. That's where the next decision sits. Whether lawmakers find a real compromise or just delay the fight again will tell us a lot about where this political moment is headed. One thing is clear. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the pause between chapters. Stay informed. Because in moments like this, understanding what's happening matters more than ever.